Continuing with the same example, let's imagine we have another instance variable called isAlive, which will be Boolean in nature and can have only two values, either true or false. So let me add this to the constructor as well. So in this case, it will be this dot is alive. And for the object creation, I will do is alive colon, and the value could either be true or false, because technically most of the people that we register in our application is going to be an alive person, but in certain age cases we might register that person too, just say. However, if we are creating another object, suppose here, and we make it learner2, we have to mention is alive true again, and we do the same thing for learner3, we have to mention is alive true again. We are constantly mentioning true in most of the objects we create, and that is becoming repetitive. So we need a way to say that, hey, whenever an object of a person is created, assume that the value is going to be true unless otherwise specified. So what we can do is that we can define the default value here. So in this case, this could be true and it is not required anymore. So now we can omit it from the object creation and remove the repetitive object creation. However, if you still print it, you will still get the value as true. So in case I do learner2 dot is alive, this should still be true because the default value is defined here. As you can see, the console says true. You can also define the default value while declaring as well. So here you can add true, and now you can remove this from the constructor completely. But now imagine you wanted to update the living status of a person and make it false later. Since this is a public variable, you can do learner2 dot is alive is equal to false now. However, it is not recommended to manipulate data like this. So let's make this variable as a private variable. And now you cannot access it. You can see the error says the setter is alive isn't defined for this type person because it's private and you cannot access it. So it's not able to find this variable for you to access. But the question in your mind might be, hey, how do we ever access or update the living status of a person now? Would it remain the default value forever? Of course not. And that's why in such cases we have the dart getters and setters. Well, these are the special class methods that are only used for manipulating data of the class fields. So here you can see this is a getter method where you define the return type. So in this case, since this is a getter for this private Boolean variable is alive, so the return type here is also Boolean, and you add the keyword get and then the name of the getter. So in this case, I have made this living status, and you return this private variable itself. And the setter is used to update the value of is alive. So in this case, you take the new value and you assign it back to your private variable. So now let's update the main method and use the getters and setters instead of directly accessing and updating the data. So in this case, if I have to update is alive, I can use this setter here instead of is alive and equate it to false. And to get the final value, instead of calling is alive, I can use this getter value, which is living status, and all the errors are now gone. Now similarly, age should have a getter or setter as well because it will change in each year. But one field that will not change at all is probably the name of the person. But now I can do the same and update the name of the person like this, which should not be really allowed. So how do we make sure that the name field once set should not be allowed to be changed again? Yes, like most languages, we can simply just declare it as a final variable, and now the compiler won't allow you to update the value anymore. It says the name cannot be used as a setter because it is final. So you cannot do this setting behavior anymore. So let's remove that. But let's imagine a scenario where your country is assigning identification numbers to all persons, but this number is not readily available while creating or registering the person. But once set, this value also cannot change. So this means I cannot have this as a part of the object creation, but it should still be a final variable, right? However, this throws an error because all final variables must be initialized, while identification number is not. So this throws an error because all final variables must be initialized, but I know that the initialization will happen, but later. Okay, so let's tell that to the compiler then. Add this late keyword and the compiler will now know that this will be initialized sometime later in the future, and since it is final, once the value is set, it will be immutable. By the way, it is not required to have the late keyword along with final. It just made sense in our use case. So you can also create a variable with the late keyword but without the final keyword, which means that the initialization would still be later, but you can also mutate the data later again. Let me bring back the final keyword for our use case. Now, what if for certain cases identification number is readily available while registering the person? Can we have another constructor that takes in the variable as well? Well, in Dart, we cannot create multiple constructors with the same name, even if they have different parameters. But we do have something more interesting, like person dot with identity. And then you can choose the different instance variables that needs to be part of this constructor. So in this case, you do have all of this plus identification. Let's add the semicolon. But in this case, this will be a required one because this data is non-nullable in nature. Now let's create an object with a new named constructor. So in this case, suppose I just change this person to with identity. And we also need to provide the identification number because this is required for this constructor, this special constructor with identity. So in this case, identification number colon, and you can have something here. So now as you can see, you created one object with the normal generative constructor, but you can also create multiple other constructors that are named for different purposes. And here you can create the object similarly like this. Wow, we learned a bunch of things about Dart classes and objects, and I'm sure the list is still not over and there are tons of things to still know about. But we will get to most of them once we start building our project.